From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
It was horrific, extremely terrifying. I still wake up from sleep startled. Why, I ask, why would they do this? We are civilians sitting in our cars. Most of the cars had families in them. So why did this happen?
As jurors begin deliberating in the murder and manslaughter trial of 4 former Blackwater operatives accused of killing 14 Iraqi civilians in Baghdad's Nisour Square, we look at Blackwater's youngest victim, a documentary by the Oscar-nominated filmmakers Jeremy Scahill and Rick Rowley. Then we go to Hong Kong, China, where thousands protested over the weekend. 19 members of Occupy Central were arrested Monday, calling for greater political freedom. But first, 2 federal judges issue major rulings to prevent most of the abortion clinics in Texas and all of them in Louisiana from closing. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Fighting continues to rage in eastern Ukraine amidst a worsening standoff between Kiev and Moscow. Separatist rebels have made several gains on Ukrainian forces in recent days. Ukraine says Russian troops are directly involved, with President Petro Poroshenko accusing Moscow of, quote, direct and open aggression. On Monday, Russia renewed calls for a ceasefire between the Ukrainian government and the separatists, but Ukraine has vowed to continue the fight, saying a ceasefire would mark a Russian victory. In a statement, the Ukrainian defense minister, Valery Galety, said, quote, a great war has arrived at our doorstep, the likes of which Europe has not seen since World War II. Unfortunately, the losses in such a war will be measured not in the hundreds, but thousands and tens of thousands. The continued violence in Ukraine comes ahead of a NATO summit in Britain later this week. NATO officials say they plan to approve a 4,000-member force that could be rapidly deployed to Eastern Europe in response to, quote, Russia's aggressive behavior. President Obama has notified Congress of new U.S. airstrikes on Iraq nearly 1 month after they began. Over the weekend, U.S. warplanes bombed targets around the Iraqi city of Amerli, which has been under a 2-month siege by the militant group Islamic State. Iraqi forces and Shiite fighters were able to break the siege Sunday. The attacks come as President Obama weighs strikes on ISIL in neighboring Syria. Speaking to NBC's Meet the Press, Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein said when it comes to taking on the Islamic State, President Obama has been too cautious.
I've learned one thing about this president, and that is he's very cautious. Maybe in this instance, too cautious. I do know that the military, I know that the State Department, I know that others have been putting plans together. And so hopefully those plans will coalesce into a strategy that can encourage that coalition from Arab nations.
The U.S. has carried out over 100 strikes on Iraq since President Obama ordered the bombing campaign on August 8th. On Monday, the UN Human Rights Council voted to investigate the Islamic State for crimes and abuses at the request of the Iraqi government. The U.S. has carried out a new military operation in Somalia. The Pentagon says it was targeting leaders of the militant group al-Shabaab, but released no further details. Local reports say U.S. drones launched attacks Monday near the port city of Barawi on al-Shabaab's stronghold. The strike comes as the Washington Post reports the U.S. has reached an agreement to open a second drone base in Niger. Israel has announced what's believed to be its largest seizure of Palestinian land in 3 decades. The Israeli government says it'll take nearly 1,000 acres near Bethlehem to help expand one of its illegal West Bank settlements. Yariv Oppenheimer of the Israeli group Peace Now said the Israeli government's undermining any chances of a negotiated peace.
This new declaration of expansion of settlements by the Israeli government is very significant. We don't remember such a big announcements in the last 1 or 2 decades. This is a stab in the back of Abbas and the moderate people in the Palestinian Authority. Instead of strengthening the Palestinian Authority versus Hamas, Israel is showing its other side and actually in a unilateral move expand settlements activity and destroy destroy the chance for renegotiation with the Palestinian Authority.
The Israeli cabinet voted last week to seize more Palestinian territory in response to the June kidnapping and murder of 3 settler teenagers in the West Bank. Meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, a UN-backed group says it'll take 20 years to repair the damage caused by Israel's recent assault. According to Shelter Cluster, Israel's 7-week attack on Gaza destroyed 17,000 housing units. Palestinian officials say Israel's continued to ban the import of construction materials since last month's ceasefire agreement was reached. Pakistan continues to face a political crisis in the face of massive anti-government protests. Thousands of people camped out in front of the Parliament building in Islamabad in a call for the resignation of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. Opponents accuse Sharif of corruption and vote rigging. The protests have turned violent in recent days, with demonstrators briefly occupying a government broadcaster and street clashes that left 3 dead and over 500 wounded. The Pakistani Parliament's holding an emergency session to discuss the crisis today. Protesters marched in Ferguson, Missouri Saturday, 3 weeks after the police killing of unarmed African-American teenager Michael Brown. The officer who killed Brown, Darren Wilson, remains on paid leave as he faces a grand jury investigation.
People are beyond angry and we're frustrated. We feel that 3 weeks later, there's been no actionable words. We don't have an arrest. We don't even really know why the officer has not been indicted.
Among those who attended Saturday's march was the Reverend Raphael Warnock, senior pastor of Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church.
Because while this is an issue that occurred in Ferguson, it really is emblematic of a national problem. The national problem being police brutality, the over-policing of communities of color. Mike Brown died as a tragic casualty in an ongoing battle, it seems to me, for the soul of America.
On Monday, a small group staged a symbolic action by blocking a state highway for several minutes, bringing traffic to a halt. A larger highway blockade was called off after a request from Michael Brown's father. Organizers say they plan to hold another highway blockade at a later date in a bid for the appointment of a special prosecutor. An Oklahoma police officer has been indicted on allegations of rape and sexual assault against 8 women, all of them African-American. Daniel Holtzclaw is accused of carrying out the alleged assaults after threatening victims with arrest if they didn't comply with his sexual demands. He faces charges of rape, forcible oral sodomy, sexual battery, and indecent exposure. Federal judges have blocked a pair of new laws that could have closed most of Texas's 19 abortion clinics and all 5 of Louisiana's. On Friday, a federal judge blocked a Texas law due to take effect Monday that would have required all abortion clinics to meet the same standards as hospital-style surgery centers, even those that offer non-surgical abortions with medication and simple early surgical abortions. Last year, the controversial rule drew mass protest and an 11-hour filibuster by State Senator Wendy Davis, who's now running for governor. Meanwhile, Sunday, a federal judge in Louisiana issued a temporary restraining order just hours before a new abortion law would have begun forcing physicians who provide abortion services to have patient-admitting privileges at a hospital within 30 miles of their practice. We'll have more on the story after headlines. The nation's top immigration court has issued a landmark ruling for immigrant women victimized by domestic violence in their home countries. The Board of Immigration Appeals ruled last week for the first time immigrant women who face severe abuse from a spouse or partner can obtain U.S. asylum. The ruling came after the Obama administration abandoned a long-running federal stance in the case of an abuse victim from Guatemala. President Obama has vowed to take executive action on immigration reform by the end of the summer in the absence of Congress, but he's now reportedly considering a delay until after the midterm elections. The New York Times reports Obama's deciding whether to put off action until November in a bid to help vulnerable Senate Democrats. And the author and reporter Charles Bowden has died at the age of 69. Bowden reported extensively for newspapers and magazines, authored 11 books, many about drug violence in Mexico after the passage of NAFTA. Cartoonist Max Cannon told the Tucson Sentinel he lived on his own terms to the extreme. He was a master wordsmith, a detective, a poet, a scholar, a gentleman, rogue, and a fearless traveler into humanity's darkest places. In 2010, Charles Bowden spoke to Democracy Now! About his views on how to end drug violence and massive migration in Mexico.
Renegotiate NAFTA. We can't have a peaceful country where it destroys the livelihood of the people in it. There's got to be decent wages. You have to have the right to organize a union. You have to have plants that have environmental controls. 2, realize the war on drugs is a disaster. It's 40 years in. We're at war with our own people. We're destroying nations like Mexico. We've got, if you're against drugs, and most of your viewers and listeners are on them, only they got them from their doctor. If you're against drugs, this is a public health issue. You don't send a cop because you're having a cardiac. That's a start. The third thing is change our immigration law. We got 20,000 men and women now on the line with guns hunting Mexicans. These Mexicans are coming north because NAFTA in good parts destroyed their economic base in Mexico. You're not going to have a peaceful world if you're making war on the poor. Now, I don't have a solution to immigration, but I know one solution is nobody's going to stay there until they have a decent living there. If we destroy their living, they're going to come here.
To see our full interview with Charles Bowden, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. Again, the journalist died this weekend at the age of 69. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to major developments in women's access to abortion. Over the past 3 days, federal judges have blocked a pair of new laws that could have forced the closing of the majority of Texas's 19 abortion clinics and all 5 of Louisiana's. On Friday, a federal judge blocked a Texas law due to go into effect Monday that would have required all abortion clinics to meet the same standards as hospital-style surgery centers, even those that offer non-surgical abortions with medication and simple early surgical abortions. Texas already requires clinics that provide abortions after 16 weeks of pregnancy to meet surgical center standards. Last week, the controversial rule drew mass protest and an 11-hour filibuster by State Senator Wendy Davis, who's now running for governor. Judge Lee Yackel of the U.S. District Court in Austin ruled the new mandate would place unjustified obstacles on women's access to abortion without providing significant medical benefits. Meanwhile, Sunday, a federal judge in Louisiana issued a temporary restraining order just hours before a new abortion law would have begun forcing physicians who provide abortion services to have patient-admitting privileges at a hospital within 30 miles of their practice. This relates to another portion of the ruling in Texas. Judge Yackel wrote 2 abortion clinics in the state's isolated Rio Grande Valley, one in El Paso, another in McAllen, could be excused from an admitting privileges requirement already on the books in Texas. For more, we're joined by the CEO of Whole Woman's Health, which operates the McAllen Clinic along with 4 other clinics and was a party in this lawsuit. Amy Hagstrom Miller has been working in abortion care since 1989. And is the founder of CEO of Whole Woman's Health. She joins us now from Charlottesville, Virginia, on the campus of the University of Virginia. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Amy. Can you start off by talking about the significance of both of these rulings?
Absolutely. Yes, Friday was just a very significant day for us. It's been a long fight and it's been a long year, just since HB2 was passed over a year ago. But really, we've seen this cumulative effect over the last 10 years with a new restriction passed, making access to safe professional care more and more difficult for women in states like Texas and Louisiana. And so Judge Yackel's decision was a strong decision. He outlined a lot of the things that we've been talking about an undue burden for women, and specifically women of color and women in rural areas throughout the South who have even higher burdens than those of us who live in the urban areas. And so his decision was very clear, and we're very optimistic that the courts are starting to see that these restrictions have nothing to do with women's safety, but are about politics.
Before we move on to the case in Louisiana, explain exactly what the law would have required and what Judge Yackel said he would put on hold.
So there's 4 different provisions in the law that was passed a year and a half ago. The most highly covered and the most restrictive are the hospital admitting privileges and the requirement that all procedures, even as you said, medication abortion procedures and very simple first trimester procedures, be done in basically a mini hospital, an ambulatory surgical center. That is the part of the law that was set to go into effect yesterday that Judge Yackel blocked on Friday. The admitting privileges, part of the regulation, went into effect last November, and we brought another case challenging that also in Yackel's court. And that case is in the Fifth Circuit right now. We've asked for an en banc decision. There were 2 other provisions of HB2, one restricting abortion care beyond 20 weeks, and 2 basically making medication abortion almost unavailable to most women by requiring women to come in for 4 different visits with the same physician. So all 4 of those provisions are part of HB2, and they combine to create an almost impossible environment for, 1, abortion providers to stay open and serve the women in the communities, and 2, for women to actually be able to travel and make it to a safe professional provider in the state.
Some might say, well, what is wrong with having a clinic that is, hospital level, and the other, why not have doctors have admitting privileges at local hospitals? What are the problems with these?
2 different things. One is that there wasn't a safety problem with abortion care in the state of Texas that these laws were addressing. Abortion has been safely provided for over 40 years in the state in small sort of doctor's office-based settings. Abortion, while it is morally and ethically complex for a lot of people, medically it's quite a simple procedure. There are no incisions. The procedure itself takes 5 or 6 minutes, and it's very adequately and safely provided in a doctor's office or clinic setting. So this mini hospital setting that requires hallway widths and airflow systems and sort of a much more intricate and involved physical plant is really designed for much more invasive and complicated surgeries like knee surgery or eye surgery or surgeries that take 3 or 4 hours with general anesthesia, which is just not the complexity of abortion. And so herein lies the problem, is that the actual cost to build one of those facilities is out of reach for the vast majority of us who serve the women who need abortion care in the state. Secondarily,
go ahead.
Secondarily, the admitting privileges is another interesting thing. This is the only procedure that requires admitting privileges for physicians. The vast majority of our medical system is delivered outside of that sort of surgical hospital setting. There are many physicians who have private practices in their offices where they're doing minor procedures in their practice, and they're not bringing surgeries into the hospital setting. It's complicated to explain really quickly, but hospital admitting privileges are a relationship between the hospital and a doctor that require the physician to admit a certain amount of patients annually. And most abortion providers, may admit 1 or 2 patients in a span of 10 years. And so this requirement, it doesn't actually have to do with safety, it has to do with access.
Can you talk about your clinic in McAllen, what Judge Yackel's decision in Texas means for the women's abortion clinic there?
Yes, we are making plans to reopen our McAllen clinic. It has been on Main Street, right across from City Hall, in the city of McAllen for years. Women have been calling us. Whether or not the clinic is open, the women in the community still need the care. And so we've been managing, trying to help women travel north and help women manage their health care in the absence of our ability to provide it. And so we're delighted to be able to reopen the facility later this week. We're making plans, trying to reach out to our staff and our physicians and try to set up a surgical session as soon as possible. The phone has been ringing the whole time, even when we've been closed, and we've been trying to help those women. And so right when the law was enjoined this past Friday, we began to call some of the women who had called us earlier that week and telling them that later this week we hope to be able to actually see them locally in the McAllen clinic again.
And the number of clinics that have closed since the law was passed, and how many you see might open like yours?
So in 2012, there were 44 facilities serving the population in the state of Texas. That's dropped to 19 at this point. And if the law hadn't been enjoined, we would drop again to 6. With this injunction, there are many of us that will be able to either stay open, like my my Fort Worth office and my San Antonio office, and my McAllen office will be able to reopen. And there'll probably be other providers that are able to reopen their facilities. Hopefully, our Austin office and our Beaumont clinic that we had to close earlier this year, we're looking at reopening them as well. I think the majority of us in the state, especially those of us that are community-based, independent providers, are really watching closely to the Fifth Circuit. As you know, the state challenged Judge Yackel's injunction within about 30 minutes of him issuing it, and has challenged it already to the Fifth Circuit. So we're watching fairly closely to see what's going to happen next for us.
Finally, we only have, we have less than a minute, but talk about the decision that came out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
So it's my understanding that, I'm not an expert in Louisiana like I am in Texas, but it's my understanding that decision also blocked a very restrictive law from going into effect that would have taken that state's clinics from 5 down to just 2, which is completely inadequate to serve the needs of the women in that community and throughout that state.
Well, Amy Hagstrom-Miller, I want to thank you very much for being with us, working in abortion care since 1989, founder and CEO of Whole Women's Health. This is Democracy Now! When we return, the jurors are out in the Blackwater case, the killing of 14 civilians in Nisour Square in 2007. We'll bring you the voice of the father of the youngest victim. Stay with us. Baghdad Night, Nasir Shamma, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Jurors will begin deliberating this week in the murder and manslaughter trial of 4 former Blackwater operatives allegedly involved in a 2007 massacre at Baghdad's Nisour Square. The suspects are charged with the deaths of 14 of the 17 Iraqi civilians who died when their Blackwater unit indiscriminately opened fire. The trial features testimony from witnesses who survived the attack and saw loved ones gunned down. In closing arguments last week, prosecutors said Blackwater guards had shot fleeing civilians and boasted of taking their lives. Nisour Square is the highest-profile deadly incident involving Blackwater or any private war contractor. The first witness to testify in the Blackwater trial was a man named Mohammed Kanani. He broke down when describing how his 9-year-old son, Ali, was shot in the head while riding in the back seat of the family car. Kanani reportedly sobbed so uncontrollably when testifying that Judge Royce Lamberth temporarily dismissed the jury. The next day, one juror said she'd been too haunted to sleep, causing the judge to excuse her from service. Well, we turn now to a remarkable documentary that tells Mohammed and Ali Kanani's story. It's called Blackwater's Youngest Victim. The film was created by Big Noise Films and Democracy Now! In association with The Nation magazine and The Nation Institute, shot by Rick Rowley, narrated by Jeremy Scahill. It begins with Mohammed Kanani recalling the day he lost his son.
I am not just remembering the scene, I am reliving it as if it were happening now. I will never forget those few minutes. So whatever you ask me, I will answer with absolute clarity. All I could hear from my car were gunshots and the sound of glass shattering, and the sound of tires blown out with bullets. I started to scream, "They killed my son! They killed my son!" What can I tell you? It was like the end of days. With cold blood and stone hearts, they continued shooting.
Blackwater's youngest victim.
Baghdad, September 16, 2007. Shortly before noon, a convoy of 4 armored vehicles departs the Green Zone, the heavily fortified U.S. base in Iraq. The men inside of the vehicles are elite private soldiers working for Blackwater, their code name, Raven 23. The men had defied orders from their superiors to remain in the Green Zone and proceeded onto the streets of Baghdad. As they departed, they were again told to return to base. They didn't. Within minutes, Blackwater Raven 23 would arrive at the congested Baghdad intersection known as Nisr Square. 15 minutes later, at least 17 Iraqi civilians would be dead, more than 20 others wounded, in a shooting that would go down in infamy as Baghdad's Bloody Sunday. You probably have never heard his name, but you likely know something about how 9-year-old Ali Mohammed Hafed Kanani died. He was the youngest person killed by Blackwater forces at Nisr Square. To this day, Blackwater has never faced justice for killing Ali and the other Iraqis that day. But his father Mohammed, who was with Ali in the square, is determined to change that.
I want the truth. I want the truth to be known and the criminals punished.
This is the story of the death of young Ali Kanani, and his father has provided us with the most detailed eyewitness account of the Nisr Square massacre ever given to a U.S. media outlet. Mohammed Hafed Abdulrazak Kanani and his wife Fatima lived with their 3 children in Baghdad. Mohammed ran his family's auto parts business, and he adored his youngest son Ali, whom the family affectionately called by his kid nickname, Alawi.
He would sleep in my arm. He was 9.5 years old, but still slept on my arm. He had his own room, but he never slept alone. When he turned 9, I told him it was time to stop using my arm as his pillow. I said, "Son, you're getting older. Go to sleep with your brothers, on your bed in your room." Your name is Ali. We used to call you Alawi, but you'll be a man soon. So he said, "As you wish, father." He always said that. So I looked and saw his feet under the door. I called him in. He opened the door and said, "Dad, I'm Alawi, not Ali." He was telling me that he was still a child. After that, he kept sleeping in my arm. It was the only pillow he ever had.
When U.S. forces rolled into Baghdad in April of 2003, Mohammed proudly took his son to greet the men he called their liberators, the U.S. military. Mohammed was that rare personification of the neoconservative narrative about the U.S. invasion.
The first day the American army entered Baghdad, I handed out juice and candy in the street to celebrate our liberation from Saddam.
Before September 16, 2007, Mohammed had never heard of Blackwater. Now he thinks of them and that day every waking moment. He remembers that Ali was not supposed to be in his car that day. Mohammed had just pulled away from his family's home on his way to pick up his sister Janan and her children for a visit. Ali came running out of the house.
He was quiet the whole ride. But then we passed a newly built park, a garden. So he turned to me and asked, "Daddy, when are you going to bring us here?" I told him, next week, hopefully, if God wills it.
Mohammed and Ali picked up Janan and her 3 children and made their way back home. The return journey would bring them through Nisr Square. When Mohammed found himself in a traffic jam at the square that day, he thought it was a U.S. military checkpoint. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary to him when he saw the armored vehicles block off traffic.
One of the guards gestured toward us with his hands. This gesture means stop, so we stopped. I and all the cars in front and behind me stopped. We followed their orders. At that point, I didn't even know they were Blackwater. I didn't know it was a security company. I thought it was some sort of American Army unit, or maybe a military police unit. In any case, we followed their orders.
As Mohammed and his family waited in the SUV, the man in the car next to them was frantic. "I think someone was shot in the car in front of you," he told Mohammed. It was then Mohammed watched in horror as Blackwater gunners, for no apparent reason, blew up a white Kia sedan in front of his eyes. Inside, Mohammed would later learn, were a young Iraqi medical student and his mother.
There was absolutely no shooting or any sign of danger for us or Blackwater. No one was in the slightest danger. Suddenly, in the flash of a second, they started shooting in all directions. And it wasn't warning shots. They were shooting as if they were fighting in the field. By the time they stopped shooting, the car looked like a sieve. This is the only way to describe it, because it was truly riddled with bullets. They finished with the first car and turned their guns on us. It turned into the apocalypse.
As chaos and blood flooded the square, Mohammed remembers the fate of one man in particular who tried to flee the Blackwater gunmen.
Everyone was trying to escape. Whoever wasn't shot dead in their car just wanted to escape somehow. When one man tried to run, they shot him. He dropped dead on the spot. He was on the ground bleeding, and they were shooting non-stop. They shot like they were trying to kill everyone they could see. He sank into his own blood. And every minute, they would go back and shoot him again. And I could see his body shake with every bullet. He was dead, but his body shook with the bullets. He would shoot at someone else and then go back to shooting at this dead man. The man is dead in a pool of blood. Why would you keep shooting him?
As Mohammed sat in his SUV with his 9-year-old son Ali, his sister Janan, and her 3 children, he realized that for them, attempting to escape was not an option. As the shooting intensified, Mohammed yelled for the kids to get down. He and Janan did the same.
Bullets were coming from the right and the left. My younger sister was trying to cover me with her body. So I pulled out of her grip and covered her with my body to protect her. I have pictures that show the headrest of my sister's seat is full of bullet holes. It was horrific, extremely terrifying. I still wake up from sleep startled. Why, I ask, why would they do this? We are civilians sitting in our cars. Most of the cars had families in them. So why did this happen? I kept hearing boom, boom, boom in my car. Bullets were flying everywhere. It was horrific, horrific. I don't know. I don't know how to describe it. After they had killed everyone in sight, My sister and I kept still. I had her rest her head on my lap and my body was on top of her. We would sneak to peek from under the dashboard. They continued shooting here and there, killing this and that one. Then it cleared. Nothing was moving on the street. Only the Blackwater men were moving. Then they drove off.
It seemed to Mohammed like a miracle had blessed his car. We're alive, he thought. As the Blackwater forces retreated, Mohammed told Janan he was going to check on the man who'd been repeatedly shot by Blackwater. It was then Mohammed's world crumbled.
When I got out of the car, my nephew said, Uncle, Alawi's dead. My sister started screaming, and I turned to look at Ali. I turned and saw that his window was broken. It was shot. I looked at him and his head was resting at the side of the door. I opened the door to see if he was okay. I opened the door and he started falling out. I stood there in shock, watching him as the door opened, and his brain fell to the ground between my feet. I looked at his brain on the ground and I pushed him back into the car. I told my sister that they had blown his brains out. I started to scream, "They killed my son! They killed my son!" I was turning and screaming. People were standing on the roof of the nearby building saying, "Get out! Get out!" But I was in another world. They killed my son and I was looking at his brain. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. I reached through the window to check his heart, and it was beating. I told my sister, who said, "Let's rush him to the hospital. Maybe he can still make it." But I knew his brain was on the ground. He's gone. I turned the car, which had no water, no tires, and I spun it around. I drove towards Yarmouk Hospital.
At the hospital, Mohammed was told that because of Ali's severe head injuries, an ambulance would need to rush him across town to a neurological hospital.
Riding in the ambulance, I was completely destroyed. My son was dying in front of my eyes. He was suffering. His arms were shaking and almost pulled out the IVs. So I held his hand still. He died. What can I say? My son? Up to the night before his death, my son never slept alone.
That night, Mohammed returned home, and his father greeted him at the door.
I love my father. He's my friend, my life and my father. He hugged me tight and he said, "Son, be a man. Don't break down." Everyone else, my mother, my sister, all broke down in tears. My wife told me, "I want my son from you. You took him. Now give him back." She looked me in the eyes and said, "It is you who took my son. I don't know what you're talking about. I want him back." What can I say? I don't know what to say. I was speechless.
Mohammed later returned to Nicer Square to gather what pieces he could find of Ali's skull and brain. The family then laid Ali to rest in the Shiite holy city of Najaf.
My son died innocent, at an age when there are no strings attached. He flew up to heaven like a white dove.
After Ali died, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad contacted Mohammed, offering his family a $10,000 condolence payment, making clear it was not a remedy for what happened and not a substitute for any potential legal action against the shooters. Initially, Mohammed refused the money, but the embassy pursued his family, urging them to take it. They eventually did, but with one condition, that half the money be donated to the family of a U.S. soldier killed in Iraq. Mohammed's wife Fatima delivered the gift to the U.S. Embassy.
This is a gift from Ali's family, to whichever family you choose. The family of any soldier who lost his life for the sake of Iraq. I want you to give it as a gift. I know it is insignificant, but it is an emotional and moral gesture from us to them.
Mohammed carries around a letter sent to his family by General Ray Odierno, the commander of U.S. forces in Iraq. "Your substantial generosity on behalf of the families of fallen American soldiers," Odierno wrote, "has touched me deeply." While Mohammed and his family mourn the death of Ali, half a world away in Washington, D.C., Blackwater's owner, Eric Prince, was summoned before the U.S. Congress.
"The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth."
Blackwater, Prince said, had been the victim of an armed ambush by Iraqi insurgents at Nicer Square, and he defended the conduct of his men, saying they had, quote, "acted appropriately at all times."
You do admit that Blackwater personnel have shot and killed innocent civilians, don't you?
No, sir, I disagree with that. I think there's been times when guys are using defensive force to protect themselves, to protect the package they're trying to get away from danger. There could be ricochets. There are traffic accidents. Yes, this is war.
Mohammed watched those hearings live and was outraged.
I wish they would ask the head of Blackwater, did he think that this child was a threat to his company? This giant company with all the biggest weapons, guns, and planes. Was this boy a threat to them?
At the hearing, a State Department document was produced, revealing that before Nicer Square, the department had coordinated with Blackwater to set a low payout for Iraqi shooting victims because, in the words of a department security official, if it was too high, Iraqis may try to get killed by our guys to financially guarantee their family's future. Despite Prince's brazen denials, the thought of suing Blackwater didn't cross Mohammed's mind. He didn't want anyone's money. He readily cooperated with the U.S. military and federal investigators, and he believed that justice would be done in America. Then, he says, Blackwater stepped in. In February of 2008, ABC News did a brief story about Mohammed. The day the story was posted online, Blackwater's attorney threatened to take legal action against the network, accusing ABC of defamation. What outraged Mohammed was that Blackwater denied its forces killed Ali, claiming instead that he was killed by a stray bullet, possibly fired by the U.S. military, an hour after Blackwater personnel had departed the scene. Blackwater claimed Ali was hit by a warning shot that ricocheted and killed him. It was not even possible, the Blackwater lawyer claimed, that Blackwater was responsible. Shortly after that, Mohammed said an Iraqi attorney approached him, but he wasn't just any lawyer. Jafar al-Musawi was the chief prosecutor of the Supreme Iraqi Criminal Tribunal, which prosecuted Saddam Hussein. He was the Iraqi lawyer. Mohammed agreed to meet with Musawi and Blackwater's regional manager. He says they offered him $20,000.
I said, I'm not taking a penny from you. I want nothing. I asked them if they wanted to resolve the problem. They said yes. I said, okay, get me a pen and paper. I said, look, I have the paper and I can sign and waive all my rights, all of them. I will sign now, but under one condition. I want the head of Blackwater to apologize publicly to me in America and say, we killed your son and we're sorry. That's all I want. I told them I don't want $50,000 or $20,000. I just want him to publicly apologize. That would be enough for me. Blackwater's regional manager said, we do not apologize. I said, you kill my son and you go on TV and publicly accuse me and all Iraqis of being mercenaries who intentionally have you kill us for the compensation. And you were under oath in front of Congress and you tell me you will not apologize. What do you want then? Why did you bring me here? He said, no, we won't apologize.
Mohammed then confronted the Blackwater manager about the company's claim that the U.S. military, not Blackwater, may have killed Ali.
I told their manager, my son was killed in the car with me. How can you say it was the military? Do you want to stain the reputation of the American army? The American army is innocent of this. Why would you blame this on them? Do you want us to hate them more? Aren't you an American company and this is your national military? Why would you do this to your own? I told him, we love the American army more than you do.
Mohammed threw the pen and paper at the Blackwater manager and left the meeting.
So I had no choice but to go the legal route and take things to court. To get justice, to bring closure for the victims' families. And to deter other criminals from committing the same crime.
On September 15, 2009, the night before the second anniversary of Ali's death, Mohammed Kanani sued Blackwater in its home state of North Carolina, along with Blackwater's owner Eric Prince and the 6 men he believes are responsible for Ali's death. Mohammed is represented by Paul Dickinson and Gary Mauney. They're not political lawyers. To them, the nationality and citizenship of their client is irrelevant, as is the country housing the scene of the alleged crimes. Mohammed's lawyer, Paul Dickinson.
The U.S. Army was over there fighting for people just like Mohammed, and he's come here with a heart full of belief in the justice system in the United States.
This is not a case about national security at all.
Dickinson's colleague, Gary Mauney.
These were people who were in a public square in Iraq, much like the main intersection in Charlotte, North Carolina is called Trade and Tron. It's the primary intersection in the city where we live. It's the equivalent place for where this occurred. The Blackwater employees were in that square and they opened fire.
Dickinson and Mauney have gathered volumes of evidence and interviewed scores of eyewitnesses, but perhaps their greatest piece of evidence comes from one of the men they're suing, Jeremy Ridgway, a turret gunner on the Raven 23 team that day. He pled guilty to killing an unarmed civilian. Mauney points to Ridgway's own sworn statements.
What Mr. Ridgway has said is that Raven 23 was not supposed to be there, and that what they did was not justified by any provocation whatsoever. This is not some lawyer making a hyperbolic argument. This is Mr. Ridgway, who was there, who was working for Blackwater at the time.
In addition to Jeremy Ridgway's statement, Mauney and Dickinson plan to introduce statements made by other Blackwater guards in the square that day, who said they were horrified at what their colleagues did, saying that they shot at civilians for nothing and for no reason. With the Justice Department's criminal case against Blackwater very much up in the air, Mohammed Kanani could well be the one man left standing between Blackwater and total impunity for the Nicer Square massacre.
This is the last case that's standing in the United States right now. This is it. This is it.
As we wrap up our time together, Mohammed Kanani shows us a cell phone video of young Ali hopping around a swimming pool with his cousins and siblings. With a smile ear to ear, Ali approaches Mohammed's cell phone camera and says to his dad, "I am Alawi."
Blackwater's youngest victim by the Oscar-nominated filmmakers Jeremy Scahill and Rick Rowley. Jurors begin deliberations this week in the manslaughter trial of 4 former Blackwater operatives involved in the September 16, 2007 massacre at Baghdad's Nisour Square. Mohammed Kanani was the first to testify in the trial. His 9-year-old son, Ali, was killed in the square that day. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Back in a minute. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to China, to Hong Kong, where 19 people were arrested Monday, one day after thousands protested calling for greater political freedom. The demonstration was organized by a group called Occupy Central, a day after the Chinese government rejected demands for Hong Kong to freely choose its next leader in 2017. Under the new rules, Hong Kong voters will be allowed to choose the territory's own chief executive, but all candidates must first be approved by a nominating panel. Activists fear the nominating panel will be controlled by pro-Beijing loyalists who will prevent opposition candidates from running. Protesters with Occupy Central are now threatening to blockade Hong Kong's central business district. Hong Kong was under British rule for over 150 years. In 1997, it returned to Chinese rule, but has operated under different economic and political systems than mainland China, as part of a policy known as One Country, Two Systems. To talk more about the protests, we go to Hong Kong to speak with Claudia Mo, a Hong Kong legislator, founding member of the Civic Party, former journalist. She attended the protests on Sunday. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Claudia Mo. Tell us why the protests.
Well, China has practically shut the door on Hong Kong's political reform. And instead, they've announced this framework under which they will screen out any election candidates Beijing finds undesirable, unwanted by Beijing. This is fake democracy. We cannot accept any fake democracy. It's going to be like North Korea. So we have to take to the street to protest, and we're fighting this battle, and we've been doing it for years and years. We may not win. We haven't won it yet, but we will fight on.
On Monday, pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong disrupted a speech by the senior Beijing official Li Fei of China's National People's Congress. They chanted slogans, waved placards accusing Beijing of breaking its promise to allow Hong Kong to select its leaders directly. After the protests stopped, Li Fei continued to defend Beijing's position.
The goal of the nomination committee is to reduce the risks involved in universal suffrage. 1, it reduces the risk of political confrontation. 2, it cuts the risk of a constitutional crisis. And 3, it minimizes the risk of populism.
In mainland China, attitudes about the events in Hong Kong are reportedly mixed. On China's Twitter-like platform, Sina Weibo, some users have criticized protesters in Hong Kong for pushing for democracy now rather than while under British colonial rule. One user wrote, quote, "I just want to ask Hong Kongers, how is it that during British rule you didn't even bring up the one-person, one-vote demand for Hong Kong's governor?" Could you respond to that, Claudia Mo?
Yeah, I mean, it's a permanent question, but it's also very ridiculous. It's a no-brainer, really. When Hong Kong was under colonial rule, it's colonialism. What do you expect? We are living under somebody else's roof, right? It's a colony, so that's it. And I have to add that the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, actually did a very good job about fighting for more democracy for Hong Kong at that time. But anyway, these days, after 1997, we're supposed to come under one country, two systems, and we're supposed to enjoy a high degree of autonomy, i.e., except for defense, except for diplomacy, Hong Kong people should be allowed. We're supposed to enjoy our own autonomy. We can decide on our future, etc. But Beijing now has turned back on its own word. It's practically telling Hong Kong that it's got complete jurisdiction over Hong Kong. And democracy, we want to give you that much, it's that much. And if we don't like it, the idea at all, that's it. That's all you can get. And this is not fair. And I think the UK government in particular should at least say something. I know there's very little London can do, but it's a moral obligation on London's part that they should at least tell China not to go back on its word.
Can you explain what Occupy Central is and talk about its plans to blockade the central business district of Hong Kong, Claudia Mo?
Yeah, Occupy Central, this idea, I think it was sparked by Occupy Wall Street. And, well, it's not quite, what we're fighting for is not exactly the same. In America, you're fighting against sort of established capitalism and vested interests, greed is good, and so on and so forth. But in Hong Kong, we're fighting against this established political might called the Chinese Communist Party. And we use the Central District, which is our CBD, as the equivalent. And we're going to be there to, well, I mean, sort of block traffic and not exactly to try to scare Beijing, but to show the rest of the world, the international community, that we have loads of grievances, particularly on this political front, and we need international attention on our plight.
What exactly are you calling for, Claudia Mo?
We're not pro any Western country. We're pro universal human rights. We're just asking for the basic, not just one man, one vote kind of election, but we have genuine choices of candidates. Beijing can handpick a couple of candidates, or maybe three, up to candidate A, and then B, and then C, or their appointees. It's all Beijing's loyalists, Beijing lackeys, basically. And you ask Hong Kong people to vote, and you claim it's one man, one vote, and you can pretend that Hong Kong is enjoying some kind of democracy. I don't want to particularly sound grand, but all Democrats in Hong Kong, we realize we're answerable to history and we're responsible for our next generations. If we cannot get genuine democracy at this stage, we'd rather keep the status quo and we'll soldier on.
Claudia Mo, Hong Kong legislator, Civic Party founding member, attended the protests on Sunday. Former journalist, thanks so much for joining us, speaking to us from Hong Kong. And that does it for the broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burker, Nate Peltz, Aramati, Nermin Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Alcoff, Hani Masood, Ravi Karen, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.